kind of processes would you use for each of those areas? What process would you use for context, for leadership? You know, we discuss certain things from each of those clauses. So when you look at the first question, what are the criteria you might use for the processes for context? Or what are the criteria you might use for the processes for leadership? Okay, I'm making it much harder for you, but it means I haven't given you the answers yet. So please again take about 15 minutes to go through thinking about criteria for context, leadership, planning, resources, and operations. Okay? Makes it a little bit more specific. Are we nearly ready? Has any group dealt with anything other than Clause 4 so far? Has anyone looked at Clause 5, Clause 6, Clause 7 or Clause 8? You've done Clause 6? 6? 5? 6? Okay. I just want to make sure someone covers some of the other clauses, please. Okay, 5 more minutes. Your 5 minutes is finished. So who would like to start? One group? You have an opinion? Raphael again. Which clause are you going to talk about?
Well, question number 1 about the examples of criteria for processes. In this case, we discuss about a chemical laboratory, exothermic reactions, chemical reactions.
Yeah.
And we had to be very careful about the temperatures, the fire, the gases. That is so important in order to be safe in that kind of operations.
Okay.
And we work in specific spaces and have, for instance, for gases, we need certain kind of cartridge in order to trap.
What I'm hearing is that for a specific set of hazards, you're saying that all the controls are identified and put in place.
Yeah.
Okay, that's one criteria.
Yeah, and it's related with the clause 6 because we have to review the risk analysis, the identification of hazards, established controls.
Okay.
That's why we need to know how long this equipment is used. The cartridge, the life of the cartridge depends on the material inside this kind of cartridge, but also the protective personal equipment.
Okay.
We also need that kind of things.
Yep.
Just for control the processes. Sounds strange, but...
So from my hierarchy of control, where are your opportunities for removing the hazard altogether?
Well...
You can't avoid it?
Maintenance is the key issue because we need to know if we are operating in safety condition.
Okay. Thank you. So anyone else? Different clause? Different comments over here? Yeah.
And we think in a more general context respect to the criteria, necessary criteria for the processes.
Okay.
And this question was a few confused for us, but we determined two main things that is important to take in account the criteria for the processes, and one of these is the quality norms for any process that you can do. And the second one is the operative rules.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this group over here now, I think.
Well, in the context part, we talk about the analysis of the expectations of the workers and the part interested in the process, and establish the goals of this process. And in the part of leadership, we talk about establish and communicate the policies and the objectives, establish through the process of establish the context of the organization. Always the theme of about economic resource to do the process, establish roles and responsibilities, involve all the personnel that take in part of the organization, internal and external parts, survey to the workers and satisfaction about this process. And in the part of clause 6, we talk about risk action to taking account of these risks and hazards, and taking account of the opportunities of improve on these things. And in the clause 7, we talk about resource in human resource, infrastructure, and in the environmental of work, commitment and capacitations.
Okay, very good, thank you. You've covered almost everything. Does anyone else want to say anything? No? Okay. If I look at something like the context clause, so 4.1 is about issues, it's a bit vague. 4.2 was identify the interested parties and their needs, and you identified that one. How do you make sure if a new contractor is coming on site that they are identified as a new interested party and that you then identify their specific needs? How does your system cope with that? Are you even aware that you have a new contractor coming onto site? This is where we start talking about the integration of health and safety into the business management system. So you probably have a facilities management function that looks after the buildings and infrastructure. You're more concerned with running a laboratory. Suddenly you find someone is drilling holes in the wall in your laboratory because they're fixing some pipe and you didn't know about it. How does the coordination occur to make sure that the health and safety management process ensures that you're kept aware because some new activity is happening and that the health and safety requirements from that activity have been determined? Do you have processes in place to do that? So that's the sort of criteria I'm looking at, is how do we make sure that we're all kept aware of what's going on and the risks arising from different activities? Okay? 5, I think you're right, making sure the policy and objectives are set. But policy and objectives, that's a top management function. But normally the health and safety manager is probably not top management. So is he going to be comfortable, or she going to be comfortable, going to the senior director and saying, you haven't set the policy. You need to do this. There has to be a degree of feedback and responsibility that the senior directors accept from those they make responsible for the health and safety system. Clause 6, I think that's much more within an activity as Raphael described. There are certain aspects where there are risks of things happening, and you need to control those risks. But as I mentioned, what about the opportunities? Clause 7, resources. Yesterday when we were discussing resources, again, I talked about coordination between your lists of equipment and facilities, your people, etc. Again, this is an indication of where you need to integrate your business processes with health and safety, because the qualification and competence of your people will be recorded with human resources. How does that get communicated to the health and safety managers? Or how do health and safety managers ensure that in the recruitment process for new people, questions about their health and safety competence are asked? So this is why we're saying you shouldn't extract health and safety management systems from day-to-day business operations. Okay? I think that's enough. I think I've given you some ideas to think about for when you're setting up your systems. Okay? So now we're going to look at clause 9, which is about measuring and monitoring. There are several parts to it. Monitoring, well, overall it's called performance evaluation. 9.1 is about monitoring, 9.2 about internal audit, and 9.3 about management review. If you're familiar with 18,001, there's not much change. Monitoring, measurement, analysis, and performance evaluation, it's really about what do you have to monitor, the methods you're going to use, when you're going to monitor and measure, when the results should be analyzed, and who you have to communicate the results to. It also requires you to determine the criteria for measuring health and safety performance. Now, performance is quite a strange word. It was actually introduced in the 18001 standard because people said having a system is all very well, it could be a bit bureaucratic, but really fundamentally what we want to make sure is that no one gets harmed. So they were slightly separating the ultimate objective of the system from the system itself. But this concept has been introduced into all of the management system standards now. So those of you who deal with the ISO 9000 standard or the ISO 14000, you will also see performance there. If you ask people about performance for health and safety, what do they normally tell you? They tell you about the statistics, about the number of accidents and incidents. That's absolutely irrelevant. That's past performance. It doesn't tell you about the future. The whole system is about being preventive for the future. Now, past statistics can show you trends. So you can say, you know, we created this initiative last year, we can see that it is being effective, certain accidents in certain areas have reduced significantly. Okay, that's useful. But if you're really thinking about performance, you need to be thinking about controlling the future. So how do you do that? Well, you need to understand your system. You need to understand what it's managing. You need to understand the hazards and risks, etc. And from that, you need to understand if the controls you have are sufficient, both now and for the future. And from that, you will need to consider the performance based on the degree of confidence you have that the controls are currently effective and will remain effective in the future. And if you think somewhere is weak, that's where you start directing your improvement activity. Okay? So it's a different idea of performance from what you would normally hear about. And that's where I think you need to focus when managing health and safety. There's a second clause about evaluation of compliance. This is again about legal requirements. This was separated from general monitoring and measuring because the financial penalties could be quite high for failing to comply. I talked about that earlier. Okay? Internal audits, they're one of the primary means of getting information about the performance of a system. Many companies and organizations treat internal audits specifically as evaluation of compliance with the requirements of the standard. You can do more than that. You can use internal audits as a means of identifying where improvements need to happen. There is a whole theory about what we call value-adding auditing, and I would suggest you go and read about that. Don't just use an internal audit for strict compliance. Yes, that's the key function of the internal audit, but the internal audit is also to provide the managers with information about your system and your performance in general. Okay? Internal audit, there's bullet D is a little bit awkward. It's about who do you report the results to. And again, I've mentioned the tension between our labour representatives on the committee and the industrial representatives. Internal audit is a very sensitive issue. You're getting management information. Should that be shared with everyone, or should that be confidential to the managers? So the way the standard is written is that you have to ensure that relevant audit results are given to workers and, where they exist, representatives and other relevant interested parties. The relevant allows you as the organization to decide what information you give and to whom, okay? If you're not familiar with it, there is an ISO standard, ISO 19011, giving guidance about conducting management system audits. And even more precise, the committee that wrote the ISO 45001 standard also wrote this ISO technical specification 17021 Part 10, giving requirements for competency for managing health and safety audits. Now that's about the competency of the people managing the audit process as well as competency requirements for auditors, okay? Management review. It says top management shall review the organization's health and safety management system at planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. Within the annex, the information annex to the standard, we actually say what we mean by these three words of suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. So suitability refers to how the system fits the organization, its operation, its culture. That's quite interesting. You know, is it that someone in the health and safety department has designed a very bureaucratic system, whereas actually your organization is a more fluid type organization, and that trying to impose something rigidly bureaucratic will upset the people who are going to have to use the system? Remember all the parts about consultation with workers and participation and commitment. You know, if you try and be too rigid and too bureaucratic with people who generally work in a more fluid way, they might not accept the system. So, is the system suitable for the organization? Is it adequate? Does it meet the requirements of the standard and is implemented properly? And is it effective in achieving the intended outcomes? Okay? There are some comparisons between what was in the old standard and what's in the new one. A little bit more focused, I think, on decisions relating to opportunities and decisions relating to the strategic direction of the organization. But otherwise, I think it's fairly straightforward. Management has to review the system. It has to identify opportunities where possible and take action on them. Again, we have this relevant word in relation to management review outputs. Management review is even more confidential to senior managers than internal audit results. And there was a huge argument in the committee. The Labour representative said all the results of management review should be available to everyone. To which the industry people said, we will never use the standard if you require that from us. So again, it's top management has the right to decide what outputs from the management review process will be communicated to workers and other interested parties. So I'm now going to set you another exercise. Similar, the first question, we talked about criteria for processes. Now, what about performance indicators for processes? That's the first question. And the second is, how frequently should you conduct internal audits? Does an internal audit need to cover all the clauses of 45,001, or what should it cover? And how frequently should you conduct management reviews? We did discuss that a little bit earlier. So, can you take about another 15 minutes to discuss these in your groups? Yeah? Thank you. Are we ready? Yes? You're going to answer the question? Where's the microphone? Where's the microphone? Okay. She's going to answer it first. Okay, KPIs.
We think KPIs could be the monitoring of the procedures in general and monitoring the number and kind of laboral accidents.
Okay. But you remember I said historic data about accidents and incidents, for me, isn't performance. That's history. What about the future?
We don't
Okay,
think about
I'm
this.
not going to take that further. Okay, we'll come here. Yes, Raphael, I know.
Considering the frequency, magnitude, and controls of the risk that are identified, we can design what are the actions that our that take for
Yep.
the future.
Okay, excellent, thank you. Risk-based thinking. Come on, we've got to keep it away from Raphael.
When we say about risk analysis, frequency and impact of the risk, survey for the workers to the perception of security, and if the expectation of the system are successful for the workers, and the indicator were aligned with the objective of this management program.
Okay, good. All right, we can. No, there's someone else. There's someone else before him. What happened to the second microphone? Can you pass this?
Well, in the case of KPIs, we're thinking about the evaluation of the emergency drills.
Okay.
So not only to perform the emergency drill, is to evaluate the development of each participant
Okay.
by evaluations. In the case of the training courses, the participants of the training course should be evaluated and evaluate the performance of the person who gives the course. And
Okay.
in the case of the equipment, it's not only to put the equipment for the emergencies, it's to evaluate the performance of this equipment and evaluate if we detected some failure in the operation.
Good. Okay. All right, we have to listen to him.
We discussed exactly the same the case of the laboratory, the chemical laboratory, because sometimes we produce smokes and other gases, and we discovered one thing that maintenance, for instance, is a key performance, but we also discovered that the log of the laboratory, para los log en inglés es bitácora, the log equipment, we discovered something. We discovered sometimes we are not operating in the right conditions, but we don't write it down, these kind of things, and it's very important in order to promote the next maintenance. Instead of the established by the schedule, we need to do that because we have other conditions that are inappropriate.
Okay.
And that's something is very important to log, to write it down, this kind of different conditions that, the key performance, the maintenance is a good way, but we have something to control the future. That's
Okay.
Very important thing, what discovered in the lab.
Okay. Everyone's made useful comments. I'm going to think about two things. The first is, most of your comments have been directed at what I would call safety issues. Almost no one's mentioned health. Okay, so how are you looking at performance in health? You know, disease issues. Do you have the microphone? Yeah?
In the case of the university, all the personnel can do an examination, medical examination every year.
Okay.
In the clinical of the ISTE in
Yeah.
Mexico. So we only need to ask for this, and the clinical give us a date, and we perform the examination, complete examination.
But
medical
are you looking
examination.
at trends in health data as part of your health and safety management? See, that's an issue. The other issue I would focus on is change. You know, if you're looking forward to the future, if I know that within a certain department there's been a change in process, there's been a change in people, there's been a change in hazards, I would be wanting to monitor that very closely and assessing the performance of that going forward, more than a situation where it's completely stable and we're not getting any non-conformities being reported. So for me, change is an area where I particularly would emphasize looking forward for the future and worrying about performance. Okay? I have a question back there.
Thank you. In our group, we thought that assessing exactly the changes in absenteeism, in health, and accidents and incidents, complaints, like having a complaint booth, and how many complaints are in 1 year and then in another, and continue monitoring those. The surveys by a certain defined period, and then to see the reports from the meetings from the commissions, our committees related to health and security, so that what are they reporting in their meetings. And the two would be the semestral or the yearly assessment that could continue year by year to get these differences in timing.
Okay, good ideas. And that connects also with, you know, doing the worker surveys and culture and awareness and things like that. Useful, yeah. Okay, so I hope that's given you some ideas for KPIs and what to think about. What about how frequently should you conduct internal audits? Does anyone want to give me an answer? Daily? Why not?
Once a year.
Once a year?
Once a year.
Really? Maybe twice?
Twice a year at most.
Twice a year? Really? Okay.
Well, it depends about the emergency equipment, because of equipment should be checked every day to be sure that it's operating correctly.
That's not an audit. That's maintenance.
But it's for us, well, in our faculty, it is in some cases mandatory for some labs.
Okay.
In other cases, the internal audits, we check with the committees, as you say before, every month 3 different laboratories.
Okay.
And we give the results through written report to the authorities, so then can know the state in that moment of that places, specifically of that places, and the next month for new places. And we were checking every year around maybe 30 different places.
Okay. Really, this relates to the next question. about does an internal audit have to cover everything in the standard? And the answer is no. So an internal audit can look at different clauses from the standard, and because of that, you need to have a rolling program of internal audits where maybe you decide that for one audit you'll just do clause 4 and clause 5 with the top managers. Maybe you then look at clause 6 and 7 with process owners. It's up to you to decide what is most effective for you. Really, if you're going for certification, the certification bodies are going to come and visit you and they're going to say, what is your internal audit program? And they will expect that within a certain time period, you would have covered all of the requirements of the standard. Usually within a year, let's say. So it might be that you'll conduct 3 or 4 internal audits a year, or maybe you have a continual program with an audit team doing samples of different laboratories on different days. So there's no fixed answer to this one, but it's essential that over a certain period of time, and the time has to be reasonable, let's say 1 year, that you have covered all of the requirements of the standard and any other requirements that you set yourselves. Okay?
Charles, I just would like to, to emphasize that last thing you said, because we have had some problems in the past with our auditors not understanding that.
Mm-hmm.
That sometimes when we had an open meeting, or when we had an open meeting in the audit, internal audit, sometimes for different reasons, usually logistics, the quality managers requires the auditors to audit less time
Mm-hmm.
than the time that was already planned by our coordination. And usually this means they are not going to have enough time for checking all the requirements. And that has caused us a lot of problems in the past, especially last year. So please remind or keep that in mind, that if you accept to cut the audit time, probably you are not going to be able to finish, to review, or to check all the, or to audit, sorry, all the requirements. So probably, if you are taking that decision, that will mean that you will need to return again to those labs to audit again. So I am really saying that because last year this causes a couple of problems, very big ones, and a couple of non-conformities. And when we spoke with when we talked with the auditors about that, really the answer we received from the in the coordination was, well, we didn't know. And sorry, but that is not really an answer that we are expecting for auditors. So this has to be perfectly clear. The things that Charles said, all the requirements needs to be audited in a year. And if, in the case of the coordination, we conduct audits just once per year because the lack of resources. So if you are taking the risk to cut the audit time, you have to be completely certain that all the requirements needs to be audited. And that's one of the reasons also because we ask our certification body to be in this type of courses, because they need to check that the audits that the coordination are conducted correctly. So that's what I want to point out.
Okay. I went back to the list of titles in Clause 9, and you can read Clause 9.2.2, which is about how you establish your internal audit program. Now, we've said very simply, you must cover all of the requirements of the standard within a certain period of time, and you can cut those requirements up and do it a little bit by a little bit. Actually, for audits to be effective, you need to think a bit more than that. You need to think, what are my high-risk areas? You know, should I audit the high-risk areas every single audit? Because the effect of something going wrong there would be disastrous. And then what about the areas where I found problems? You know, do I reevaluate them in the next audit? Or, you know, if I do find something seriously wrong in a high-risk area, do I say I'm coming back and doing another audit next week? You've only got a certain amount of time to put things right. So you have to be flexible and creative with designing your audit program. It's not rigidly the clause, I will do clause 4 today, I'll do clause 5 tomorrow, whatever. Okay? So there is a risk-based element in planning your audit program. Okay? And that is driven by your health and safety needs. Okay? And I think the last question was about management reviews. How frequently should you conduct management reviews? Once a decade? Oh, okay. We wish.
In most of our management systems, we conduct it every six months.
Okay. Why?
It is regarding about how we are or is aligned about how we plan our audit program. So we try that the internal audits will be conducted at least 3 months before the external audit.
Mm-hmm.
So, and usually we suggest to the labs to conduct a management review a couple of months before the internal audit.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of months before the external audit. So usually it is around 6 months. Of course, there are some systems that conducted once per year.
Mm-hmm.
That's perfectly fine.
That sounds to me a slightly rigid process, but I understand the design of that process. For me, it really should be done according to business need. So, with many small businesses, I say to them, how often do you do management review? And they say, oh, once a year. And I go, but don't you go and see your bank manager once a month to describe how your performance is going and therefore how much money you can borrow? Isn't that effectively a management review? You know, just by adding a few extra criteria to what you discuss with the bank manager on a monthly basis, you're actually performing a management review. And what about when things change? You know, I mentioned with KPIs, change is critical. So, do you do reviews before the change to make sure that the change will be introduced in a planned way? And do you do reviews after the change to make sure it's been introduced successfully? So, I appreciate having a fairly rigid system that says or ensures that a review is done on a regular basis. That's perfectly okay. But I think the managers of the health and safety system also need to think about where they may need additional reviews. Okay? So you have to be pragmatic about it. Okay, that was Clause 9. Clause 10 is about improvement. It has 3 sections, a general clause, clause 10.2 on incidents, non-conformity, and then 10.3 on continual improvement. 10.1 doesn't exist in the common structure for management system standards. But we introduced it because in reading a standard, to go from a clause 10 that says improvement to then having a clause 10.1 saying non-conformity seems very strange. So we wanted something that described a little bit about improvement. It's one of these clauses where there's no real defined action for you to take in this clause. It's mainly descriptive, okay? 10.2, you have to have processes for managing incidents and non-conformities which include reviewing existing risk assessments. So if something goes wrong or something isn't in conformity, you need to check your current risk assessment. Was it done correctly? Was there a problem? Does it need to be redone? You need to determine corrective actions in accordance with the hierarchy of control. Again, can we look at removing the hazard? Or can we replace the hazard with something less hazardous? And you need to assess risks relating to new or changed hazards. This has to involve workers and their representatives and other interested parties, and reports need to be issued to relevant workers and their representatives and relevant interested parties. Again, this issue of relevant and the difference in opinion between the union, the labor representatives, and the industrial representatives is a huge issue. Particularly in the US, companies, when an incident happens, do not want to let the workers know about the incident reports, because often it will result in legal action and they would be providing information for their prosecution. So we had to draft this part very carefully about reports being issued to relevant workers. Okay? Sure. Microphone, please.
What about an emerging issue that you were not really expecting, and it just suddenly appears? Something new related to, I don't know, climate change, flooding, whatever.
You mean the moon crashing into the earth, for example? Is that not quite that dramatic?
No, but
No?
for instance, the virus.
Yeah.
And the spread of virus.
Okay. That's not a non-conformity or an incident.
No, but it's something that appears suddenly.
Yeah.
That can affect your hierarchy, control, and management.
The hierarchy of control is an ideal way of dealing with hazards. Okay? If you're talking about a new occurrence, had you predicted it in any shape or form? Had you thought about it? I mean, I would have expected in a university, for example, the occurrence of a new virus should have been something you predict in your health and safety system. You've got thousands of people coming together in close contact. How quickly will it spread? You know, there's lots of statistics about rates of disease transmission. I think that should be part of your system already, okay? And how you mitigate it. You know, tell the students to stay in bed. I'm sure they won't disagree with that at all. Okay? All right. So, why did we introduce the word incident when the high-level structure doesn't have it? It's just a moral issue. We didn't really feel like describing a dead body as a non-conformity. Okay, so incidents and accidents are within the health and safety standard. Accidents are defined as being incidents. So we don't actually write about accidents in the standard. We write about incidents. And an accident is an incident where harm has occurred. And as I say there, the reason for this is that many organizations, they're very good at investigating accidents, but they're quite poor at investigating incidents. So if you're trying to improve health and safety, you know, the fact that a cupboard fell but didn't squash someone, you should be asking, why did it fall? It could have hurt someone. What should we have done to prevent that? So again, it's the preventive approach. There is, however, a note in the definition of incident, and there is a lot of disagreement in the committee over this, which says that there can be one or more non-conformities related to an incident, and an incident can occur where there is no non-conformity. Some people absolutely reject that statement. They said there is no possibility of an incident occurring without something either in your risk control processes or in your management system control processes where a non-conformity would have occurred. Okay, so that one will be argued again in the future, I'm quite sure. Corrective action versus preventive action. I talked a little bit about the system being a preventive tool. So historically, corrective action is something's gone wrong, you investigate the cause of why it's gone wrong, you fix it, and then you use the lessons learned from fixing it, and you then go and investigate if there are any other similar situations or potential situations, and you apply the fix. Okay? Now, many people confused the applying the fix as being preventive action, whereas really what preventive action is preventive action is really about doing trends analysis. It's can you do some brainstorming about, you know, a potential new virus appearing? And what would you do if that new virus appeared? How would you control it? It's not related to something that has occurred. It's something that might occur. But many people couldn't understand the difference in these two concepts. And historically, auditors from quality systems, environmental systems, they would go and ask companies, what is your preventive action? Oh, look, we fixed the corrective action. So, complete lack of understanding, but we're hoping that now, within the system, because we ask you to do things like, what are the potential issues that might affect your organization in the context? And then how might you need to control those issues? You know, we are, in a way, forcing you to do the preventive action that was previously described in the standards. So this is why we don't have preventive action in the standard, and why we say that the whole system should act as a preventive tool. It might be a bit complex and theoretical, but that's the idea, okay? A little bit about when accidents happen, and this is diverging from the standard, but there's often a mistaken belief by managers that they're working in safe organizations, and they don't know how to seek out or recognize symptoms that their organizations are unsafe. And also, they generally look for someone to blame when something happens. That's human nature, okay? In reality, human factors are critical. There are often underlying causes, latent as well as active failures. Complacency, It's very common. And a poor safety culture. As I said, there's often a tendency to find someone to blame rather than fix the root cause. Typical approaches to health and safety: do nothing until something occurs, search for a primary accident cause and find a fix for that specific situation. So, you would have an accident, you investigate the accident, you attribute the primary cause to an unsafe act, and what is your fix for that unsafe act? Well, you devise a new rule, or you write a new procedure. But on the other hand, if the result of your investigation is it's ascribed to an unsafe condition, then you'll look for a technical solution. You know, new safety barriers or new alarm systems or something. So you end up with very rigid results. An example, when a plane crashes, what is the cause? Pilot error? Engine failure? The air traffic controller is still alive. You know? In reality, was the pilot competent? The causation debate is often missed. So, a single primary cause is often too simplistic. Accidents often result of a number of failures, and it can be a contribution of both conditions and behavior, and there can be latent as well as active failures. And the problem with the preventive action or the solution, once you've determined the root cause, they can be overzealous, there can be conflicts with existing rules, and they can quickly become ignored. That's the risk. So someone said 80% of accidents are a result of management failure. I've already said the concept of a single primary cause is usually a simplification of a multi-causal process. Moreover, the term unsafe act embraces a wide range of human errors, including both unintentional errors and intentional risky behavior. So the distinction between the contribution of unsafe conditions and unsafe acts sometimes hides the more important distinction between the relative contribution of conditions and behavior in prevention. Accident investigations have traditionally focused almost exclusively on the errors made by the people who've had the accident, not the managers. Not the managers. Okay? Whose errors may have created a climate and physical environment where errors by people at risk are made more likely or more serious. Unsafe acts create conditions where further unsafe acts may lead to accidents. The remote errors by managers are called latent or decision failures, and the errors by people directly at risk are called the active failures. So rules and safeguards devised after accidents are sometimes not well considered. Moreover, the measures taken to prevent one specific accident may conflict with the measures adopted to prevent a different accident and with production-oriented rules. Rule books and legislation drawn up in this way are likely to become in time both incomprehensible and contradictory. There are at least two company rules existing for any situation: the rule to get the job done in time and a more demanding rule that may be invoked when things go wrong. It's not giving us a good picture, is it? So this is the traditional culture in organizations when accidents occur. So we have almost no perception of risk. Suddenly something happens, everyone gets very excited, everyone writes new rules, procedures, puts in place new safeguards, and then we all go back to sleep again. Okay? So, that's not what we really want to see happen, is it? And our discussions about awareness, about commitment, about motivation, how do we keep re-emphasizing to people? You know, you have to be aware, you have to work safely. We don't want this sawtooth type situation to occur. And I hope some of that discussion, which I copied from somewhere else, which was why I had to read it, I'm sorry, but I hope that gives you some idea of what can happen if you don't. It's not what we want to see. So, continual improvement is the last clause in the standard. The organization needs to continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the health and safety system. And those three terms, as I said, were defined in the management review clause. And this includes focusing on performance, positive culture, promoting worker participation, and communicating improvement results. Okay? So, there is the annex giving explanatory information on many of the clauses. The clauses have been written as far as possible in alignment. So A1 aligns with clause 1, the scope, A2, etc. It's very difficult, though, when you write against one clause to another. Sometimes with bullet points, you can't get direct correlation because you need to say more in the guidance. So it's aligned as much as possible. And if you are putting in a system, please do look at the guidance in the Annex A. I'm not going to go through it. With the other old standard 18,001, there was also a sister standard 18,002 that gave guidance. And in some aspects, 18,002 was a little bit more extensive than the annex in the new ISO 45001. So the final group exercise for a health and safety system, what potential non-conformities can you determine? Which clauses in the standard can be considered to be addressing preventive action? And apart from worker consultations and internal audits, what tools and techniques can you think of that will assist in continual improvement? Okay? So, you have until your coffee break to think about these, and then we will come back after coffee break and listen to your ideas. Please start talking to each other. Okay? The coffee is available outside? You know already. Okay. To show you something.
clarify the issue of the copyright of the standard.
Okay. Okay.
Bien, antes que regresemos, me gustaría hacerles una aclaración que me han estado preguntando varias personas y que mencionó muy brevemente Charles, pero que es importante que todos tengamos claro. Todas las normas ISO tienen un copyright, ¿sí? Y no se pueden distribuir bajo ninguna circunstancia. Esa es la razón por la cual se las estamos poniendo en una nube. Y esa nube la vamos a cerrar en cuanto acabe este curso, esa es la instrucción que tiene la gente. Si ustedes quieren comprar la norma, o sea, hay que referirse a su biblioteca, sí, por favor, y cómprenla el IMNC es quien edita la norma a nivel nacional y creo que debe estar por ahí de los 800 pesos la norma. Aunque la compren, por favor, no la fotocopien y no la digitalicen porque es ilegal hacerlo, ¿sí? Y meten en un problema, se meten ustedes en un problema y un problema a la universidad. ISO ha estado cerrando muchos de los websites y tomando acciones legales muy fuertes porque se ve publicadas en algunos sitios. Entonces, eso no se debe de hacer. No se debe hacer con los papers, no se debe hacer con los libros y, por supuesto, no se debe hacer con las normas. Entonces, hay que comprarla y la pueden comprar o en el IMNC o directamente bájenla o cómprenla de la página de la ISO, les va a salir un poco más cara, pero la pueden comprar en sus bibliotecas, es lo que les sugiero yo que hagan. Y ya que cada institución o entidad ya les diga cómo lo van a manejar, o sea, la gente de las bibliotecas tiene muchísima experiencia con todo este tema de normas. Ahora, recordarán ustedes que teníamos un acuerdo con ENOR y ese acuerdo ahorita se está negociando también, entonces es muy probable que tengamos el acceso otra vez a las normas ISO en algunas semanas más en cuanto yo creo que baje el presupuesto y la Dirección General de Bibliotecas pues termine de hacer esta negociación con ENOR. Pero, de nuevo, lo que nosotros desde la Coordinación de Investigación Científica estamos solicitando es que sea un acceso nada más de visualización de la norma. No la van a poder bajar, no la van a poder imprimir y es por la simple y sencilla razón de que, o sea, tener un acceso de este tipo cuesta el 20% de lo que cuesta tenerlo que se pueda bajar e imprimir, o sea, cuesta este tipo de accesos una fortuna. Entonces, en cuanto lo tengamos les avisaremos, pero por lo pronto esta norma, si la quieren, la tienen que comprar, y nosotros vamos a implementar la política de ya no distribuir normas, porque cuando lo hemos hecho ha sido un absoluto desastre. Todo el mundo, aunque dice ahí muy claramente, tiene el sello de copia controlada, todo el mundo la fotocopia y es un desastre que no puede controlar la coordinación. Entonces, como no lo podemos controlar y este mensaje de que no deben de fotocopiar las normas no lo podemos hacer llegar a la gente, pues entonces mejor, o sea, ya optamos por no distribuirlas. Entonces, cuando las necesitemos en los cursos, vamos a seguir haciendo lo que hicimos ahorita. Las ponemos en la nube, las dejamos abiertas y después cerramos el acceso. Entonces, si quieren las normas, sí hay que comprarlas a través de la biblioteca. Thank you, Charles.
Okay, thank you. So, before Raphael returns, who would like to answer the first question? Anyone have examples of non-conformities? Okay. Okay.
Okay, for question number one, we were thinking that non-conformities could be have a regulation, a security regulation, and not abide to it.
Okay.
Have people at the enterprise or wherever we are working that is not convinced and is not continuously capacitated in programs or in plans and has no conviction. The other would be changes in personnel that are in charge of the security functions.
Okay, good.
Am I missing something?
Okay, good examples, thank you. Okay, does one of the other groups want to give us some examples, please? Yes, down here. Where is the microphone? Here.
Just have so the personnel doesn't use the proper protection equipment.
Good.
And the regular scheduled maintenance programs are not done, are not
Good.
respected. And then, well, if the proper procedures are not followed, and well, that would be more or less the same.
Okay. Anyone else? Anyone else? No? Okay. The reason I wanted to ask this question is you could have given me very simplistic answers, like saying the analysis of the context is not done, there's no evidence of leadership and commitment, there's no evidence of internal audits being done properly, or management review being conducted, etc. Actually, you gave me the answers I was looking for, which is more focusing on the needs of your system as appropriate to your situation. So you said procedures not being followed. Well, the standard doesn't talk about procedures, but you have procedures, so it's your own internal requirements not being followed as much as the requirements of the standard. And that was the point that I really wanted to emphasize here. Your system is a combination of some criteria from the standard plus your own criteria. And I think you've both identified that very well. So thank you for that answer. That was good. Okay. Question 2. Which clauses in the standard deal with preventive action? I did answer that earlier, so someone should have been listening? No? Does someone want to give me the answer? Come on. Okay, someone at the back has been paying attention this morning, maybe?
We think we should consider all the clauses because this standardization is for this purpose. So we will consider all the clauses.
Are we happy with that answer?
Another comment as well.
Okay.
That some of these are more close to what is really needed, these clauses in the standard. Leadership, planning,
Okay.
conscience, number 7, whatever, it's a long title. The planning and control, that's number 8.
Okay. All right. So when I was trying to describe the differences between corrective action and preventive action, I was talking in terms of things like doing brainstorming about potential things that might happen. And you gave the example of a new virus coming and infecting everyone. Or the moon crashing into the earth, yes, we got that. Okay. So, for me, really, preventive action is more closely related to doing the context analysis of issues and then looking at the risks coming out of those issues. So it's really clauses 4 and 6 that drive the preventive action. But you're right, almost all the clauses in the standard can be included. because leadership drives the commitment to doing that. Internal audit discovers problems in your organization. So this is why the whole system together is preventive. Thank you. Okay. And question 3. Apart from worker consultations and internal audits, what tools and techniques can you think about continual improvement? Okay.
We think in technological advances to eliminate risk, training program, infrastructure improvements program, update and new legal and regulatory guidelines. For example, in Mexico, the Norm 035, which refer to psychosocial risk in workplaces, and the federal regulation for safety and health in work.
Okay, good. Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay, my background is mainly in quality, and I don't know if you're aware of tools such as Six Sigma analysis, or SWOT analysis, or something called PESTLE, Political, Economic, Social Threat Analysis. There are a number of management type tools and exercises that you can use, very well documented, easy to look up on the internet, that can help you drive continual improvement. But I think what you've said as well is excellent. Yeah. So it's just try and find out what tools are available, see which ones are easy to use, and use them. Try them. See if they help. Okay? All right. So that really concludes item 10. That's the end of the standard. So have we any issues on the standard itself? Has anyone got any other remaining questions on the standard? If you think about them, please let me know in the next few minutes. I'm going to do a little bit about implementing ISO 45001 and some of the other issues. Okay, so we've talked about top management commitment when we talked about leadership. Really, the whole basis of putting in an ISO 45001 system depends on top management being committed to supporting it. Because it's going to demand financial resources, it's going to demand time, even their time. Top managers are not usually aware of that. You know, they're going to have to write the policies. They're going to have to show leadership. So it's not just an economic decision, it's a time-based decision for them as well. So without getting the commitment, there's no point in starting. Next, really you need to start communicating the fact you've made a decision to implement the system. And that's not just to your immediate staff, that may be to contractors and your other interested parties, because you're going to have to warn them that you may be changing the way you work. You know, contractors, suddenly you're going to be saying to them, what is your health and safety system? How is it going to integrate with our health and safety system when you come and work on our site? So there needs to be a communication process. Also, it helps, you know, once you've made the decision, to start consulting the people who the system might affect. That's part of the consultation and participation process. Then you're going to have some kind of dedicated team to actually make sure all the procedures are written, put in place, all the hazard analyses are done, all the risk assessments are done, etc. It's going to take time as well. Well, what are the sort of people who should be involved? Actually, you need a multidisciplinary team. And that needs to involve senior managers as well as some very low-level workers. They have to intermingle. They have to express their concerns. So asking for volunteers to do this is a useful way of doing it. And then you need to plan the activities you're going to go through. So do some form of initial review or gap analysis against not only the requirements of the standard, but against your legal requirements and against your own internal requirements. Okay? Then you need to start defining processes, assigning roles and responsibilities. If you identify the need for competency improvement, you're going to have to do that. One of the usual areas where we see a need for competency improvement is internal auditing. You know, most things are the standard, most companies already do. The things that are a little bit strange are internal auditing, for example. You're going to need to start putting information systems in place, or you're going to need to make sure that your current business information systems link together to create that health and safety information. You need to think about measurement and monitoring systems, internal audits, and then reporting for management reviews. Okay? You need to conduct an initial review, gap analysis, look at all the processes and activities to determine any hazards or potential sources of ill health, regulatory issues, hazards, and conduct a gap analysis against 45,001 and determine any compliance gaps. Now, usually we find with many organizations at that point, they will bring in a health and safety consultant who's familiar with the standard to help them. And especially to provide training on things like internal audits. But I think Monica has that resource for you, or part of that resource for you. Okay? Again, a fairly top management decision issue is the timeline for implementing the system. Many organizations, they find it takes about 18 months to get a system in place. Why does it take so long? It's because you have to do some internal audits. You have to provide the evidence for a future external auditor that you've conducted internal audits. You have to demonstrate you've done some management reviews. You have to demonstrate you've done some improvement. And that improvement can be based on, here's our gap analysis, look, we've now filled the gaps at the beginning stage. But it's going to take you, I think, about 18 months to get fully certified, if certification is your aim. It's not a quick process. Yes, it can be done quicker, but it will cost you more. And people will not necessarily have the time available to participate in the way you need them to. So I wouldn't expect to rush it, okay? Estimating the resources needed, well, obviously there's going to be funding issues. You've got to pay for the databases. You're going to have to appoint someone to be employed to run the system. You're going to have to do training. That's going to cost time. You may need additional equipment. So estimating the funding and other resources is again something that the top management will want information about. That can probably be best done after you've done an initial gap analysis. Okay? Determining the context, establishing the policy and objectives, that is something that top management can do quite early on in the process. I don't think that's one of the later activities. Starting to implement the system, okay, So you've created some of the processes, you've documented them, you start asking people to use them, to start following them, and you also ask them to give you feedback on whether they're working, whether they're effective, whether they're too bureaucratic or not bureaucratic enough. That again goes into as an input to demonstrating you've done some kind of continual improvement for when you get the external audit. Training, yes, you're going to need to do training. As I just mentioned, internal auditors, but the standard also refers to training for representatives, if you have representatives. Conducting internal audits, we discussed quite a lot about the frequency and the extent of internal audits. Well, to begin with, you might want to start in a very small way, just to make sure that the people who are doing audits get used to how you audit properly. It's not an easy thing to learn how to do, you know, especially if you're trying to get truthful answers from people. It's a skill. I'm not very good at it. And also, during the implementation phase, you need to keep checking. You know, have we completed the requirements for Clause 4? So let's do an internal audit on that part. Have we done 5, 6, and 7? Can we do that? So actually, the internal audit process or program during the implementation of a system will be slightly more frequent and slightly different to what you do once your system is up and running. Okay, because it depends on the development stages you go through for implementing the standard. Conducting management reviews. Again, we talked about how frequently you should conduct management reviews and the extent and nature of them. During implementation, again, as with internal audits, you may want to do them more frequently. You want to say, you know, we had an estimate of the costs at the beginning from the initial gap analysis. Are we still managing to keep within that cost frame? What are we having to change? So, yeah, look at how you are going with the implementation and monitor progress and check that you're going to meet the timeline. Now, this diagram I could have shown you quite a lot earlier. It tries to explain how some of the clauses of the standard fit together. So the logic is that you understand your context, you understand the trends, that's the preventive action starting to happen. You understand what your stakeholders want. You do some kind of prioritization, which is really through the leadership clause, clause 5. And from that, you look at risks, threats, and opportunities, and you look at what your legal obligations or internal obligations are for compliance. And once you've understood those, then you start putting your operational system together. So that's really showing you the linking between 4, 5, 6, and 8. Obviously, 7 is the resourcing which goes around all of this, and 9 and 10, measuring, monitoring, and improving, also feed into all of this. But that's a very simplified diagram of how the different clauses work together. Okay? If you were working with the 18001 document, there is a 3-year migration program that's been agreed with the certification bodies and accreditation bodies, and effectively that standard will disappear in March 2021. So you've got another year or so on that one. Again, this highlights some of the key differences in the standards. The 18001 standard was not so good about the sort of relationship with the business environment, so it wasn't so good on context, it wasn't so good on leadership, and it wasn't so good on risks and opportunities. And again, similar to implementing a system, using cross-functional teams and doing resource analysis to make the migration happen is useful. I have a few other issues to go through. Small businesses. I don't know if this applies to you because maybe some of your departments are small and would act like a small business, but traditionally, the main area for deaths in work are very small contracting companies in the construction business. It always surprises me. I used to be a fire protection engineer. I used to deal with sprinkler systems. And you can imagine a huge shopping mall, you know, maybe a kilometer long, and you see all the fire sprinkler systems in it, and then you ask who put it in, and you think maybe a team of 20 or 30 people were employed. No, it could be a team of 3 people. And they're dealing with quite dangerous things. They're lifting very heavy pipes up to the ceiling and other hazards. So we know that from the statistics for accidents, not for health, for accidents, there's a very strong bias to small companies in the construction sector. So you have a lot of people coming to do services on your buildings. Be careful. So can we convince them to start using a formal health and safety system? The answer is yes. We've had this argument a long time with ISO 9001. People said it's too complex. Well, actually, you don't need an overly complex system. You know, if you're a small business, you tend to be doing simple functions. So maybe your system can be much simpler. But at the moment, the Committee for Health and Safety, ISO Technical Committee number 283, is actually writing a handbook to give advice to small businesses on using the standard. And it may be useful information to you in your application of the standard. There is additional advice there. I talked about the standard being based on this common Annex L framework. The framework was first published in 2012, so it's now 8 years old. It went through a review a couple of years ago, and they said it needs to be improved, and work is currently ongoing. Right now, I received the latest draft of that document yesterday. So there may be changes in the future, but that's 5 years away or so for ISO 45001. In fact, I've estimated 2027 for the next revision of 45001. But if you're dealing with other standards like 9,000 or 14,000, be aware there will be changes in the next edition. Really, the discussions in that revision work got stuck on what is the meaning of risk. The ISO Committee for Risk Management has a concept that risk can be both negative and positive. I find the concept of positive risk very strange. We tried to be simplistic in the standard. We said risk is negative effects and opportunities are positive effects. Most people seem to cope with that. But they argue that they are the official experts in ISO on risk, and we have to accept the concept of positive risk. It almost caused blood on the carpet during the discussions on that topic. So I don't think it's actually going to change. As I mentioned, there is a technical committee for health and safety. One item is the handbook, which is very nearly completed. It's developing also a standard giving guidance on accident and incident investigation, because a lot of companies find that quite difficult. It's proposed a standard on psychological health and safety in the workplace, and it's also considering a standard on health and safety performance indicators. So in the near future, these should be available to help you. In fact, the drafts, you could obtain the drafts through DGN if you wanted to see where they've got to so far. And I give the address for DGN there. Now, staying informed about what might happen in the future, there is a website, I'm sorry it's only in English at this time, for the committee, and you can go and see what it's doing on a day-to-day basis there. There's also ISO's website, there's the DGN website, and in fact the BSI group in Mexico has quite a lot of information as well. So please go and look at those sites. Promoting BSI a little bit, they've actually preempted the work in this ISO Technical Committee 283, and they've produced a number of standards in the areas I just mentioned. These are being used as the basis for the work items in the ISO committee. So, a final message. You've suffered 3-4 days of me. What have you learned? Actually, the standard is quite simple in what it says and requires of you. But fulfilling the requirements are quite complex. You know, health and safety management's not easy. I hope I've stimulated your thinking and widened your perspective on what you might need to think about. So, you know, health and safety systems can be complex, difficult to manage, and difficult to achieve the ultimate objective of no harm impacted to anyone impacted by the organization. But I've also tried to say to you, you know, there is a business reason for why we do health and safety, apart from the moral reason. And if you've got to try and convince senior managers, it's the business case that comes about. And it's about, you know, what happens if a major accident does happen? For many organizations, that could be the death of the organization. And I mentioned before, fines for non-compliance with regulation in some legal systems can be huge, 10% of global turnover. So you have to be aware of this. But if you're trying to reduce the cost of a system, having competent, well-motivated people can help you. There is an expression in the quality world that quality is free. You know, but we actually impose costs by putting in monitoring and measuring because we don't trust that people do what they should be doing properly. So the more you can motivate people to do stuff properly in the first place, you can reduce your monitoring costs potentially. But we've discussed, how do we get people motivated? That requires leadership, that requires communication, that requires interaction. And I hope that by going through the standard, I've been able to show that ISO 45001 is quite a useful tool in doing this. Okay? And really, that is the end of everything I have to say for 3 days. And I know it's Friday, so I'm letting you go 1 hour early, okay? For your psychological well-being. Okay? Thank you very much indeed for your time. Okay?
Charles, really thank you very much for, again, being with us and accepting to conduct this workshop. I think, you know, everybody will agree with me that was a very good course and, you know, with a lot of knowledge. So thank you very much for that. We would like to give you a recognition.
A certificate. Thank
Exactly,
you.
a certificate.
Okay.
And also a small gift that we hope you can enjoy.
Medicinal purposes. I have a cold. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Gracias a todos ustedes por haber estado estos 4 días con nosotros. Esperamos que haya sido de utilidad. Como se pudieron dar cuenta, hay muchos temas en esta norma que pueden ser aplicados poco a poco, o sea, no tenemos que implementarla toda, pero la idea es que refuerce los programas de salud y seguridad en los institutos, centros de investigación, nuestras facultades, pero también en sus propios laboratorios. Entonces, el tema es tener esta conciencia de todos estos temas de salud y seguridad, ¿no? Entonces, de nuevo, muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado. Muchas gracias al Instituto de Ciencias Nucleares, nuevamente por todo el apoyo, no solo pues con el préstamo a la infraestructura, sino con la transmisión también del evento. Déjenme decirles, tenemos poquita gente conectada en vivo ahorita, pero ya el día de ayer nuestra primera sesión tenía más de 300 visitas. Entonces está haciendo este tipo de cursos bastante pues demandado por la gente y bueno, esa es la idea, ¿no? Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias al instituto, gracias al personal del instituto por todo el apoyo logístico que hemos tenido de parte de ellos y por supuesto gracias a Josué y gracias a José María que nos estuvieron ayudando con toda la logística del curso. Sus constancias se las vamos a entregar en físico, Charles las va a firmar esta tarde y nada más les pedimos, van a tener que pasarlas a recoger a la coordinación y les recuerdo que como regla de la coordinación de una política es que nada más se las entregamos a la persona a la cual pues está firmada la constancia, obviamente por temas de seguridad, porque ya se han perdido algunas constancias y es difícil conseguir las firmas de nuestros ponentes. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias a todos y pues esperamos verlos muy pronto en alguna otra actividad académica que organicemos. Gracias.
Thank you.
¿Les parece si nos tomamos una foto con Charles ahorita?
Uh-oh.
We are going to take a picture with you here.
Okay.